Open the pod bay doors.
Greetings and welcome to another exciting episode of the Cinematic Traveler Podcast. I am your intrepid movie-exploring host, Chris, and on this episode, we return again to the 23rd century as I give you my review for the next Star Trek movie in our Star Trek series. That, of course, is Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, directed by Leonard Nimoy, Spock himself. Mr. Spock directing Mr. Spock. This has to be some sort of crashing of universes. But I am so excited to be talking about this movie, and I cannot wait to get into it. But before I do, could you please, whatever you're listening to this podcast on, somewhere on that screen there is a follow button. If you could please hit that, that would be amazing. It helps me. It helps the show. It also helps you because you won't miss any more episodes of my amazing reviews or my sexy, sexy voice. Also, you can leave me ratings and reviews and tell me how I'm doing with all these Star Trek movies. Are you enjoying them? You could give me 5 stars. I would appreciate that. And if you want to follow me or get in touch with me on my social media, you can reach me on Instagram at the Cinematic Traveler Pod. I do have a Twitter or X account. That one is at CMT Pod. I have a account on the Blue Sky version of the whatever. That one is at Cinematic Traveler Pod, something. I also have an email, the Cinematic Traveler Pod at gmail.com. So you have plenty of ways to get in touch with me and follow the show and keep up with everything. There, I got through that quick, fast, and in a hurry. Let me ask you, how are you doing, my beloved listener? I am so excited to be here talking to you about these Star Trek movies. And if you are continuing on from the first episode of this series, I appreciate you being here. If this is your first time listening to my Star Trek reviews, go back and listen to the other 2 so you don't miss anything. Trust me, you won't be disappointed, and we can continue this marathon session with these movies together. But I hope you're doing well out there, and if you want to continue on to the review for Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, meet me in the transporter room. All right, is everybody ready? All right, Mr. Scott, energize. All right, with Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, yes. It is directed by Leonard Nimoy in his first feature film directorial debut. He had done some television before this, but this was his big moment to shine, and the studio was a bit desperate for him to return as Mr. Spock, so he used that as a little bit of leverage to get himself in the director's chair. So with this third installment in the franchise,
do you mind telling me what this is all about, mister?
We rejoin the crew of the USS Enterprise as they return to Earth, weary from their battle with Khan. Admiral Kirk is dealing with the loss of his friend Spock when suddenly an alarm from Spock's quarters alerts him to an intruder. This intruder is, much to everyone's surprise, Dr. McCoy, who is acting a bit off. Now, Kirk assumes it's space madness and is a bit glad that the crew is home and will have some much-needed R&R. Unfortunately for them, this will be a lengthy R&R as the Enterprise is set to be decommissioned and put out to pasture. And this is some real bad timing as renegade Klingon Krug, played by Christopher Lloyd, has stolen the Genesis information, destroyed the USS Grissom, a Starfleet research ship investigating the new Genesis planet, and kidnapped Kirk's son David, as well as Lieutenant Savick, this time played by Robin Curtis, and a mysterious young Vulcan boy with a weird connection to this dying planet. To add to this Klingon chaos, Kirk has learned from Spock's father, Sarek, played by Mark Leonard, that Spock has left his Katra, or essence, deep inside McCoy. Now, don't judge. Sometimes you get lonely out in space, and that happens. But Kirk decides he must return to the Genesis planet to find his friend's body. But of course, Starfleet says no. But do you think this is going to stop Admiral Kirk? Hell no. So him and his trusty crew steal the Enterprise and they go anyway. Well, this leads to a battle with Krug that ends with a moment that makes all of us sci-fi nerds cry, as well as the death of another of Kirk's loved ones, and Kirk once again finding a way to take death and make it a fighting chance for life. Now, will Kirk... Oh, yeah, I almost did it again. You know how this is all going to end. I mean, good God, it's Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. If you haven't seen this movie, where have you been? I'm not going to ruin it for you. But like I said, in the previous 2 episodes, we do have the same crew for 6 films, so I think you can kind of figure out where the end of this movie lands. So let's go ahead and move into the review of the film. If this is your first time listening or you haven't listened in a while, I do break my reviews down into 3 segments: the good, the bad, and the nitpicky. The good of the movie are the things that work for me. The bad, obviously, things that don't. And the nitpicky, these are things that are neither good nor bad, just little things they put in these movies, Hollywoodism sometimes, or sometimes just things my weird little brain picks up on. It makes me laugh. And as I'm trying to do with this podcast, I'd love to make you laugh, because if there's 2 things I love to do on this planet, one is to make you laugh, and the other is to find a lovely woman to put my Katra inside of. Oh, Lord. Again, just to over-explain a few things, I am not doing a retrospective on Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. I'm not doing that on any of these movies. But I will add a little bit of trivia into my review. Although I will say for Star Trek 3, there wasn't a whole lot that really piqued my interest, as it were. In fact, this might be one of the quickest reviews of the series. And I'll get to why once we get to that point in the episode. You'll just have to hang on. We'll get there. There's no hurry. What else have you got to be doing right now? You know you love it. You know you love listening to me talk about Star Trek movies. And damn it, I love talking to you about them. So with the good of the movie, I think we will start with the cast of the film. Again, of course, I don't want to say this every time, but Shatner, again, gives a really great performance here. This is where we first see the renegade Kirk. I know he's portrayed, especially when they did the J.J. Abrams movie, as sort of this rebel, or he bucks the system from time to time. But really, if you go back and watch the original series all the way up to this movie, he was pretty much a company man. He followed the rules. He knew the rules. Sometimes he had to bend them, but as a starship captain out in the middle of nowhere, light years away from Earth and the leaders, he would have to make decisions on the fly. So sometimes, he would kind of dance around the rules a little bit, but not in a renegade sort of way. It was always according to what Starfleet would want him to do. And we all know by the end, Starfleet would send a message and say, "Oh, do exactly what you did, Captain Kirk." That was every episode, wasn't it? So, but this is the first one where you see him buck the system. He goes, "You know what? I'm going, whether you let me go or not." And that leads to them stealing the Enterprise. So you get a little bit of a new take on Kirk. He's still the man in charge of things. And while for most of the film, he is the Kirk that we knew and loved from the show, an extension of basically Star Trek 2 as well. He's kind of got his groove back. He's in charge. He's making decisions on the fly. He's going to do what he has to do and not be stopped, and you're not going to get in his way. He does have some quieter moments, some moments that hit home for him. There's a part in the movie that I always feel bad for him when Sarek believes that Spock has left his Katra in Kirk. He has to do a mind meld with Kirk, and basically Kirk has to relive Spock's death. And you can just see it in Shatner's performance, how he gets teary-eyed, and he has to relive that pain all over again. And you would think, as a person, that would just be so difficult, especially to have to live it so realistically through the mind meld. And he pulls that off in a very believable way. Also, when his son David is killed, just, oh my God, just the way he collapses on the deck of the Enterprise. Now, there has been contradictory reports as to whether he purposely missed the chair or accidentally missed the chair. But either way, it comes off as a just devastating blow to Kirk. And, when he tells him, "You Klingon bastard, you killed my son," you could feel the pain in him. And then, oh, do I even want to talk about this? Oh, this moment in this movie. It's such a gut punch. I mean, the last movie we had the death of Spock. In this one, we have the destruction of the Enterprise, which, as I mentioned, all of us sci-fi nerds we tear up on that poor ship. I mean, she was the Enterprise. No, don't blow her up. You got to save her. No, she doesn't get saved. She gets destroyed so that they could escape. And as she's burning up in the atmosphere and they're standing out on that cliff watching, you could see the pain in his eyes because that was his love. That's what he sacrificed everything for in his whole life, was to be captain of that ship. And there she went. So yeah, he does another great job. So I don't think we have to go too far into his performance. I will say something this movie does better than the last two is it brings the other cast members a little more to the front of the film. I happen to think that is because of Leonard Nimoy, and I don't know if this falls in the trivia for this movie, but he always seemed to be the kind of guy who wanted everyone that was involved in the original series to have some sort of part in these movies or something afterwards. I know that when they did the animated series, I think that was in the early 70s, they only wanted him and Kirk, maybe one other of the original crew, but he said he wasn't coming back unless they all got a part because all of the cast members are struggling a little bit after the show was canceled. So again, he got him a paycheck, and I think he always kind of was as I would say, Shatner's the one everybody hated. I feel like Nimoy was probably the one everybody liked. So I think that's why we get more performances from the other cast members. But, DeForest Kelley, he does a great job because he's got Spock's katra in him, basically his soul or his essence. I don't know what it is. But, he switches between himself and Spock, like in the space bar when he's trying to get a ride out to the Genesis planet. And he has these moments where, like, the waitress says, "What's your poison, doctor?" And he's like, "It would be illogical to order poison." Or when the security guard tries to grab him and he does the neck pinch. Of course, it doesn't work because he's not a Vulcan. But he has all these moments where he sort of bounces between being Spock and then going back to being himself that adds some comical moments to the movie, as well as some emotion, because there's a time towards the end of the movie after they do find Spock, spoiler alert, where McCoy is talking to him before all of the ceremony that gets the katra back to Spock's body. But, it's a really moving moment where he tells him, despite everything, I just miss you and I want you back, kind of sort of thing. So it was nice to see Bones or DeForest Kelley. He's always had sort of a big part in the show, and he's been kind of there in the movies, but it was nice to see him get a little more screen time. I think really the unsung hero of this movie is James Doohan as Scotty. I think he has some of the best comedic moments in the film where he sabotages the Excelsior, the other ship that gets sent out to track down the Enterprise, because he steals like the bolts off the warp drive or something like that. There's that moment where he's going into the elevator on the Excelsior and it's like, "Have a nice day." And he's like, "Up your shaft." Or one of my favorites is when they're trying to get out of the space dock because the doors are shut and the Enterprise is getting closer and closer. And Kirk leans into Scott. He's like, "Now, Mr. Scott." And Scott just looks at him like, "What?" He's, the doors. And he's like, "Yeah, I know. I'm working on it." Just that little interaction right there. It was priceless. And again, it was nice to see him sort of on the screen more because he's such a likable character. Everybody loves Scotty, and he has more to do here. Also, on a side note, they have the Klingons in this film, and they expanded the language more. But just to remind you that James Doohan invented the Klingon language in Star Trek The Motion Picture, and then they brought in the linguist from UCLA who expanded out further so they could have all that extra dialogue. And while I say the crew gets more to do, especially Bones and Scotty, the other ones, they don't have huge moments in the movie, but they got a few. Sulu has the one where he helps to break Bones out of the little mental hospital or whatever he's in. And the guy calls him Tiny, kicks his ass. He goes, "Don't call me Tiny." Which George Takei, he didn't really care much for that scene, and he didn't really want it in the movie until he saw the audience reaction, which I don't know why. He comes off as a badass in the scene, but, actors, they're kind of whiny. Uhura, Again, doesn't have a lot to do, but her scene that she gets to do something in is pretty awesome, where she's in the little room and the guy's complaining. The young guy, he's like, oh man, I want to be out there doing something. And he kind of makes a statement about like how she's been in the service for like basically calling her old. And then she gets to turn the tables on him. And she's like, you wanted adventure? Well, here it is. And he says something about reality, and she just looks at him and goes, this isn't reality. So it's a really great scene. I'm trying to think if Chekhov did anything in this movie. I think he's probably the only cast member that didn't have a whole lot that stood out to me. But then again, he was in most of Star Trek too. So yeah, it was nice to see the other members of the original crew get more to do in the film. And really, in the next movie, they get even more to do. So you could see where, they were having some fun in these roles and bringing a life to this movie. Speaking of that, you got Christopher Lloyd as the Klingon Captain Krug, who's just a straight out evil villain who wants that Genesis device. They all want that Genesis device. And while it's a bit fun to see Christopher Lloyd in that role, because before that, of course, he was Reverend Jim on Taxi. If you've never seen him on Taxi, you should really go watch some clips of Christopher Lloyd as Jim on Taxi. He's priceless. I think this was before Back to the Future, which is what we associate him with now. So when you go back and watch this movie, it's like, there's Doc Brown. Why is he trying to kill Captain Kirk? Because he's still got Christopher Lloyd's voice, but he really does a good job as this imposing character. He's got that typical evil bad guy chewing up scenery. He kills one of his crew members when he tells the guy, just shoot the engines of the USS Grissom. And the gunner blows up the whole thing, and he shoots him with that damn Klingon phaser. Man, that thing is brutal in this movie. It kind of disintegrates you from the spot it hits you all the way through. So it looks like you could feel it the whole way. The person screaming, oh, it was brutal. But yeah, he does a good job as the villain. You hate him all the way through the movie, especially because he makes Kirk blow up the Enterprise. Why would you do that? David has a little bit of a part of Merritt Buttrick. He has sort of, I don't know, his character's arc is kind of sad because basically the writers, Harv Bennett and I think Leonard Nimoy, they decided that David should pay for his tampering with the Genesis device to make it work faster when he put in the proto matter or whatever the hell it was, because that's basically what caused all the issues in Star Trek 2. If he wouldn't have done that, then they wouldn't have had all of these deaths surrounding this planet. So they made him be the sacrificial lamb, and he gets killed by the Klingons, which we'll get to in a moment. But yeah, he has his heroic moment as he's going out, at least. Robin Curtis, as I mentioned, she takes over for Savick. Another behind-the-scenes issue was that Kirstie Alley had suddenly become a big star after Star Trek II. And they didn't have her under contract for any more Star Trek movies, so when they came back to her and said, hey, Kirstie, come be in the movie again, naturally she said, you best pay up. And they said, you know what? We can put them ears on anybody. And while I appreciate Robin Curtis's performance, I feel bad for her having to follow Kirstie Alley in the role. She does a good enough job that at first you're like, hey, wait a minute, that's not Savick. But, she basically becomes Savick as the movie goes along. So while not a brilliant performance, she does well enough in the role that once you get over the initial shock of it not being Kirstie Alley, you kind of fall in with the performance. And I was a bit surprised as I was watching this movie at some of the cameos in the film. There's Phil Morris, a name you might not know from this movie, but you definitely know if you're a Seinfeld fan. He played Jackie Childs, the lawyer that Kramer always went to and seemed to screw over time and again. He was in this movie. John Larroquette, yes, multiple Emmy Award-winning John Larroquette, plays one of the crew for the Klingon vessel. He's unrecognizable. You have to really listen to those voices to tell which one he is, but he was in the movie. Grace Lee Whitney appears in the movie. Of course, Lieutenant Rand from the original series. I mentioned her in the first review for Star Trek The Motion Picture, but it was nice to see her back in the movie. And a very young Miguel Ferrer is the first officer of the USS Excelsior. Of course, we all know him from various movies. One of my favorites was Hot Shots Part 2. But of course, who cannot remember him as Bob Morton from RoboCop? And one other fun little cameo, there are some tribbles In the spacebar scene, some people are playing with tribbles. Hopefully they don't get in trouble with those tribbles. So moving into the next positive of the movie, as this is Leonard Nimoy's first directing job for a major motion picture, I would say he does a pretty good job in the film. It isn't as well crafted as I would say Star Trek 2 is, but that's not anything hugely negative for the movie. I think it does what it needs to in this movie. It's a little more straightforward of a film. It's just kind of your straightforward action film. You know the plot. It doesn't deal a whole lot with different themes like Star Trek 2 did. This one basically is about, you being loyal to your friends and what are you willing to do for these friends? Are you willing to go risk your life to save their life? And that's kind of basically the main theme of the movie. But, like I said, it moves at a pretty breakneck pace. You get back to spaceport. They find out they're not allowed to go. They say, fuck it, we're going anyway. You get your fight with the Klingons, the destruction of the Enterprise. Why? Why did they have to destroy the Enterprise? But once they do that, and then you get the fight at the end, and then bam, the movie's over. So it picks up right where the last one left off. It feels like a very productive sequel. It feels like you're continuing that story, and that you'll get more of in the next film as well. That kind of wraps up the story. But all in all, I think this was a fun watch. It's only like an hour and 45 minutes, so it cruises right along. It's a fun little adventure film that has a great emotional payoff at the end. And then once again, for the music, they bring back James Horner, who reprises some of his themes, bring in some new music. He knew exactly how to play up the action parts of the movie, as well as kind of, like I said in the last review, hit those quiet moments as well. So all in all, as far as just the overall production or feel of the movie, I think it feels very much like a Star Trek story that is a natural continuation of what we left off with in Star Trek 2. So moving into the negative of the film, and I told you this one would probably move along a little quicker. I think they recap at the beginning of the movie. They do a recap of the end of Star Trek 2. So you see the death of Spock again. And that came from Harv Bennett. He was a TV producer for the longest time. So I guess he felt like we were all dumb and we needed to have it repeated, which was, to me, as I watched it again this time, maybe the first time I watched it, it wasn't as noticeable. But this time, it was noticeable because, like I said, you get that moment between Sarek and Kirk where Kirk has to relive that scene again. They use the same dialogue. And then it gets repeated again at the end when Spock comes back from the ceremony and he meets Jim. Your name is Jim. And they have basically the same conversation they had at the end of Star Trek 2. So you get to relive that moment a couple of times in the movie naturally. I don't really think you needed that recap. Also, it was a bit weird. They never say anything about Khan in the movie. And then Carol Marcus is not brought up at all either. So I wish maybe something, I could maybe let the one about Khan slide, but I wish they'd have said something about Carol Marcus not being there. I did read that BB Best, she was very upset that they didn't ask her to come back, and then they explained to her why, and when she saw the movie, she said, okay, I get it now, I understand. It was basically so that it wouldn't be as confusing for us in the audience when David dies, because basically, like I said, he had to pay the price for what he did, and they didn't want her in there, because then you're asking questions about, well, did she know? And if she was in there working hand in hand, wouldn't she understand that this got put in there and stuff like that? So it would raise more questions than just being like, oh my God, they killed his son and all that. So I get it. I just wish they'd have found a different way around that. They could have done anything, just said like, oh, she went off to research this or something like that. But I wish they'd add a little something between those two, especially as impactful as Star Trek 2 was to the franchise. It would have been nice to hear something about that. As far as David's death, while Kirk does have that moment on the Enterprise where he basically collapses after it happens, it really feels like it kind of happens and then it's over. When we had Star Trek 2 with Spock's death, it was such an impactful moment. You had the whole end of the movie that you're like swimming in the emotions from that moment. And here, it's just like, okay, it's a powerful punch to Kirk, but let's get back up and keep moving, which, again, it's in keeping with what they're doing at that time in the movie, but it would have been nice to have a quiet moment at some point towards the end of the movie where he reflects on that. It does pay off in Star Trek 6 when we get there, which I'm glad they kind of revisited that, but I wish they'd have done a little more with that. Let's see, outside of that, I really can't think of anything too negative for this movie, which I'm going to bring something up later in this review that always confuses me about this film. Poor Star Trek 3. I'll get to it in a moment. Let's go ahead and move to the nitpicky. Again, these are things they put in these movies, sometimes Hollywoodisms, sometimes just little things I pick up on that make me laugh. And hopefully, I can make you laugh as well. The first thing, and we've talked about Katra, but it always strikes me as weird that Spock would have never, and the whole time that he knew Captain Kirk, ever mentioned this whole Katra and what comes with it and this ceremony that they can do and all that. You would think if you had the ability to take your essence or your soul and put it in another person until they can put it somewhere else, you would mention that in a conversation. You might be like, Jim, while we're heading out in the deep recesses of space where crazy monsters kill us at any moment, let me just let you know, sometimes for us Vulcans, we have this ability to transfer our consciousness to someone else. So please, don't just fire my body off out into the void of space. Tried to find my soul wherever I put it. Where did I put that thing? Is it next to my car keys? I can never remember. But I always just sit there and go, I think I would have told somebody at some point. It would only be logical to do something like that. Let's see, my next nitpick. This one makes me laugh. All right. So for those of you who may or may not know, the Pomfar for Vulcans happens every 7 years, where basically the Vulcan male has to get it on. He has to relieve some tension, as it were. Every 7 years it gets built up. That must be a hell of a proton torpedo shot. That's all I got to say after 7 years. But at any rate, so they're on the planet, and there's a point where Saavik basically has Vulcan sex with young Spock to relieve that tension. Now, obviously, it's not some graphic sex scene. They do their little hand thing or whatever the hell that is. But I'm sitting there thinking, well, he keeps aging with the planet. And by the time Kirk gets him off the planet, he's basically middle-aged Spock. So every 7 years, is Saavik having to go out there and get it on with Spock? Spock's probably like, hey, I don't want to leave the planet right now. Can y'all wait about 3 or 4 more years? I mean, that works out well for him. He's really putting his Katra into Saavik. All right, I've gone too far with the Katra jokes. Too far. All right, my last nitpick for this film. After the destruction of the Enterprise and Kirk's beams down with his crew there, and they go and they defeat the Klingons that are left on the planet, and they've got Spock and everything. And Kirk gets the communicator, and he's talking to Krug. He's like, you got to come down here and fight me and all this shit. Well, Krug beams down, and he's directly in front of them, and he's got his phaser pointed right at them, so they can't do anything. I think, what if he would have misjudged how he stood? He was like turned around, pointed the other direction. He like beams out. Oh, hey, where are you? Oh no, you got the drop on me. Damn it, I should have stood the other way. What is wrong with me? I think that would have been a far better ending to this film. Oh, Krug, you stood the wrong way, you dumb Klingon. Wah, wah, wah. So overall, my verdict for Star Trek 3, I enjoy this movie. I mentioned earlier there's something about this movie that I always feel bad for it, but there's sort of this thing where everybody says, well, the odd number of Star Trek movies are always bad. 1, 3, and 5 are bad movies, and 2, 4, and 6 are great movies. And that only applies to the first 6 movies, because once the Next Generation crew gets their movies, those are all terrible movies. I don't care what you say. Even First Contact is a dumb movie. Yeah, I said it, you Next Generation fans. Those movies are all garbage. But at any rate, I always watch Star Trek 3, and I'm like, this is not a bad movie. This is a good movie. Like I said, it's well-paced. It doesn't take up a lot of your time. Hour and 45 minutes, moves right along. It's an action adventure. It's got some good comedic moments to it. You're rooting for your heroes all the way to the end. It's got the main villain who's just, you just love to hate him. He's evil for evil's sake. So I don't ever understand why it gets lumped in with the bad ones. The only thing I can think, and this has probably got to be the reason, is it's sandwiched between Star Trek 2 and Star Trek 4, which are the 2 most popular movies in all the franchise, and it doesn't really live up to either of those movies. Like, it's not as perfect as Star Trek 2 is, and it's not as crowd pleasing as Star Trek 4 is, but it is a necessary film to get you from Star Trek 2 to Star Trek 4. You need Star Trek 3 or you'd be lost. And I think it flows well. They call it the Genesis trilogy 2, 3, and 4. And it perfectly picks up from where we left off, and it perfectly leads into where we go next. It has its issues, but in no way, shape, or form would I ever call this a bad movie. Like I said, it's just a fun action-adventure Star Trek flick. And I would recommend watching it if you are new to Star Trek, or if you're a Star Trek fan and your friends are like, oh, which one should I watch? Obviously, you're not going to say Star Trek 3 first, because that kind of ruins Star Trek 2. So I would tell someone, all right, when you watch Star Trek 2, definitely follow it with Star Trek 3. It's not as good as Star Trek 2, but it's still a good, fun movie, and it's going to lead into what happens next. And again, I will never understand why it gets lumped in with the bad Star Trek movies. So at any rate, that wraps up my review for Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock. Again, not a fancy review for this film, but it's a solid review for a solid film. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you're still listening, you must have. And if you did, please let me know. You can, again, get in touch with me on Instagram at Cinematic Traveler Pod, or all them other ones. My email, thecinimatictravelerpod@gmail.com. You can follow the show, give me a rating and review, and let me know what you think. Share these episodes with your friends and family on social media. I'd appreciate all the help I could get. Now, our next film in this series, it's the one that people who don't even like Star Trek will love. That, of course, is Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, or more commonly known as the one with the whales. Again, I haven't watched that one in a while either, so I'm looking forward to seeing if it still holds up after all these years. I can't wait to come back and talk to you about that. I'll have that one out next week. But until then, you can always check out my other reviews. I do reviews for new films in theaters on the weekends, and then I do a streaming surprise episode towards the end of the week. So definitely come back and check out those reviews. I've also got fan contests and stuff that you could participate in, and you can enjoy and just be a part of the family. Be a part of the Cinematic Traveler crew. We won't blow this thing up. I don't care what the Klingons do to us. Now, before I go, I just want to thank you again for taking the time out of your day to listen to my show. I greatly appreciate you as an audience member. And I tell everyone I know I've got the smartest and sexiest audience in all the podcast universe, and you never fail to live up to those high standards. And as you are traveling around on this blue and green ball bouncing through the cosmos, I need you to do one thing for me. Live long and prosper.